Welcome back, everyone. It's our third episode of the season of Spring 2022. We're back after a 2-year hiatus. And my guest here today is Caterina Passoni, the co-founder and co-director of Havenly Treats here in New Haven. So for those of you listening or watching, if you live in New Haven, go down to Temple Street across from the cinema and try their amazing cafe, or order food online or order catering. So, Caterina, maybe we can get started by just hearing a little bit about what Havenly does, and tell us a little bit about your personal journey and how you got into this.
So Havenly is a social enterprise. It's based here in New Haven, and our mission is to build the community power of refugee and immigrant women.
Build the community
Power
of
refugee
build the community power of refugee
and immigrant women.
And
we do so through job training, education, and organizing. And so what all of that means is that we have a cafe, and we provide a 6-month fellowship program to refugee and immigrant women that are stuck in cycles of poverty or marginalization. And they work with us, learn with us. They take English classes, financial literacy classes, and basically start planning for their careers, start building bridges, getting skills, and then we help them find a job. So that's kind of the core of what we do. And since our founding, we've done a lot more work and are now doing more community building and organizing and kind of political organizing work.
So you studied refugee integration models in undergrad, right?
Yes.
And that's what you want to focus on in your career. So there are many pathways to getting there. How did you pick opening a cafe as a pathway?
Well, I always say I started Havenly by accident.
Okay.
I think my chosen path, according to my career plan, was supposed to be working more in monitoring and evaluation work and for international development agencies.
Monitoring and evaluation, okay.
Yes, so more like research and program development. That's what I thought I was going to do post-graduation. But when I was a sophomore, I started volunteering at IRIS, which is the local resettlement agency. And I met Nida, my co-founder, through that. I was basically tutoring English for her family. Her family was teaching me Arabic, and we became really close friends. And then she is a chef and entrepreneur herself. She ran 3 restaurants in Baghdad, and then after that was displaced and unemployed in New Haven for a really long time. And so my senior year of college, we started selling her baklava and the butteries, which are the late night cafes in Yale College. And that's how it started. And then we were awarded the Sci-City Accelerator grant, and that's what really allowed us to stay over the summer and start thinking.
And that's the University Center for Innovative Thinking, so they support students that want to do creative things. And it sounds like sometimes they have, not they specifically, but sometimes all these different programs and initiatives that are supporting entrepreneurship can bias or direct your mission in certain ways. Tell us a little bit more about that, like innovating as a student and the people who supported you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was coming from a very academic background. Refugee integration, I had never thought about it from an entrepreneurial point of view in terms of creating my own project or creating my own model. I was very much interested in policy. I still am interested in policy and kind of looking at the way religion and race are understood in policy. And so my approach was very much not entrepreneurial. So I think I didn't really fit in with all the people in the accelerator that were had thought of themselves as entrepreneurs for a long time and were really excited about a specific, problem and product. But I think what happened is that Alessandro was my friend. He started Havenly with me, and he's Italian. And I was talking to him about this issue and the fact that I knew a lot of women that know how to cook but didn't have a job. And he said, well, this is a great idea. We should start a company. So I always say I would have never started this without his kind of point of view on if you have an idea, you should start something. I'm more of the, if you have an idea, you just write a book about it or something like that. So we started it, and Sci-City is I think it was also the beginning. Before that, it was the Yale Entrepreneurial Institute, and it was, in a sense, they were also a startup. It was one of their first iterations of the accelerator, and the accelerator is it's not for social impact specifically, it's for entrepreneurship. So they have for-profits, nonprofits, all kinds of things. I think that's important to say because they were applying the same model to all of the organizations. And so we ended up so there were 3 kind of subgroups of the accelerator: the education subgroup, the tech subgroup, and the product subgroup. And we ended up going to the product, which I think is very interesting, right?
So
because
it became about the food.
Exactly. And to be honest, at the time, we didn't really know what we were doing when we applied.
I think no entrepreneurs, when they first start out, actually, most people in the world don't know what they're doing. We're all figuring it out as we go along.
Exactly. And I think when we applied for the cohort, we had said, we're selling this baklava. It's really selling out. We have a lot of interest. And we are supporting refugee women that need a job. And that's kind of all we knew. But through the program, we were put in the product cohort, which means that we talked primarily about, our customer base and why students would want to buy baklava and how students would want to buy baklava and all of that, and not so much about what is our theory of change. To be honest, we didn't talk about theory of change at all.
So that's, I guess, theory of change, for those who aren't familiar with the terminology, that's a different way of saying my question that I asked Caterina in the beginning, like the change you want to create is building community power for refugee and immigrant women. And so what makes you think that opening a cafe is the best way to do that? So no one asked you that at the beginning?
And they talked a lot about mission, but I think, every single company nowadays has some kind of mission, like, even if they're selling
harmful products.
Exactly. They somehow are saving the environment or something like that. And so I think when they were talking about mission, they really meant, what is your one-liner that's going to be, your marketing. And I think it's interesting because I've been in other accelerators after that. I've been in the Miller Center. So Miller Center has a social entrepreneurship. It's called the Miller Center in California. And they have one, and they started with theory of change and impact, right? So I definitely think, again, that the City Center was very much beginning, and they hadn't decided exactly. And I will say that it was very helpful because we did really think through our business model and how are we going to make sales, and in that sense, really, that's what I didn't know. So I will say it was very helpful for me. I had no idea how to market a product or think through like market size or anything like that. But what my brain was thinking through was, okay, the baklava, the revenue model, and not so much the impact model. And I think, so in the beginning, we were really thinking, okay, we create a company as big as possible that, hires as many refugee women as possible, and then we solve the problem. And
so it's all about scale. I think a lot of entrepreneurship programs are trying to create scale, but scaling wide, maybe not scaling deep, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think that was also the big, word that we were always talking about, is how fast can you grow? How many people can you reach? What's the number of women that you can reach? And I think I did feel like, for that first year of trying to write all these grants about our scale and they would always ask, I remember, why are you unique or why are you original? And it's so easy now for me to respond because I understand how we, from an impact perspective, are different. But at the time, I would always respond in terms of revenue model, and I would say, oh, it's because we have like student volunteers and it's cheaper or something like that. And I could tell people were like, okay, that's not really like that unique. But, so I guess the point is that in the beginning, we were really focused on how do we make this reach as many people as possible, as fast as possible. And so we were looking at models in which we would have a huge company that really hired a lot of people. We looked at models in which we would train people to then make our same product in other companies. So you
iterated a lot of business models.
Exactly. And finally, I think actually, when COVID hit and we all started kind of rethinking our lives and what we're doing here, I think we really started thinking through our impact model and what we were doing. And Camila, who's our third co-director, joined at the time. And I really consider her a co-founder, even if, technically she wasn't there for the first few days. But she comes from a much more political organizing background. She studied power and ethnicity and race. And so we started thinking about, what is the problem that we're trying to actually solve? And that's not just getting a job. It's the fact that, refugee and immigrant women are living in such marginalized and discriminatory conditions. And so what we kept seeing was our graduates would graduate from the program and they would, have a job, but the job wasn't enough to pay for a good house. And so then how do you support someone with that? And that's when we decided to shift from just helping people find jobs to building community power. So the ability of a community to advocate for itself and to transform their circumstances. And
that's what we call systems change,
yes.
right? And that's why I brought this book by Francois Bonici, The Systems Work of Social Change. And we mentioned this in the last couple of episodes too, like you have service and scaled service in terms of, creating jobs and creating baklava, but then you also have systems change and framework change in terms of changing what it means to be a refugee, what it means to be a migrant woman, and changing some of the policies related to that. So it sounds like you've really expanded. I don't even want to say shifted. It's not that you changed your direct service. It's just that you said, this is not our bottom line. It's not really our end game. We're about much more expanded mission.
Yes, absolutely. And in a sense, that's, when people ask me about scale, that's what I call like the ultimate scale, right?
Right, scaling deep, yeah.
Exactly. And that's the scaling deep is kind of what does it mean to change the policies that cause this problem as opposed to reaching maybe 1 million people. So I think it's about a different approach, and I feel very, very comfortable and very excited about the, as you said, kind of deep over kind of numbers. And
another change it looks like you made over the years is that you've thought a lot about the actual governance of the organization and how you want the participating women to not just be participating in the program, but also in the organization. And you've created this membership system where they can actually vote on the board and vote on the executive director so that it's not a top-down approach. And you mentioned that was informed by some of the literature on lived experience. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So, so I think firstly, we want to build community power, and I think power starts with how power is divided within our own organization. And so that's also part of why we've thought so much about our internal structures. What does it mean to be pushing for these women to be in leadership positions in the world if they're not within our own organization first? And so I think the journey of how we got there is also my personal journey. Obviously, I'm a white European. I am not a refugee. I don't come from the community we serve. But I consider myself very much an ally and someone that understands myself as someone with privilege that can support the community. But I remember a few moments early on in our kind of journey during Sci City where the first moment was when I went to a talk about white saviorism and kind of the way in which a lot of white people in the nonprofit complex kind of think of themselves as saviors and really centered themselves as knowing what the community needs and therefore needing to lead the organization. And that made me think a lot. I will always remember I was like, okay, I need to reflect on how maybe I'm having some of these behaviors in my own work. And then I remember it was already really hard for me to talk about our story because it's not the problem we're solving is not my story. And I felt like it was really hard to talk about someone else's story. And I remember during the accelerator, this woman came from The Moth, the podcast, the storytelling one, and she was helping me workshop. And she was like, okay, just forget what you think you're supposed to say and just tell me how this actually started. And so I told her the story of how Nida and I became friends. And she said, when you talk about her, you talk about business partner, you talk about your collaborator, you talk about friend, but then when you're trying to pitch this, you're talking about her as a beneficiary, as if you're, so just start talking about her as your, and such a small shift started, I think, shifting almost everything, because everyone was so confused. Oh, wait, she's your business partner? What does that mean? And so I think that was really the beginning of thinking through, what does this mean? And at the time, Baljit Sandhu was a professor at Sci-City, was also doing research on lived experience.
And she's at Oxford now. She started an organization called Center for Health Equity.
Okay.
Sorry, Center for Knowledge Equity.
I
work so much on health equity, but Center for Knowledge Equity, which means valuing different parts of knowledge, not just like academic expertise, but also lived experience, which is such a huge part of systems change.
Exactly. And I remember it was pitch day, and at the end of the accelerator, which means you kind of get on the stage and you present the idea. And Nida was there, and I remember the first thing was, "This is Nida," and I was looking at her, and I was like, "Why am I standing here telling your story when you're sitting right there?" And that was one of the first moments where I said, "Okay, this is us. There's no reason why I am up here talking about this."
And by the way, to our viewers and listeners, Nida was coming here today.
Oh, yes,
and
exactly.
It's Ramadan, which is the Muslim holy month of fasting, and she's breaking her fast in in a few minutes. And B, they had like a huge number of catering orders, which is great. So she had to stay and take care of that. So shout out to Nida. Yeah.
But that's exactly a perfect example of these small practices that I started having, where I would invite her to events where I was invited, or I would think about the strategy with her, and just notice again and again, no one was asking her. And so I think that's kind of the sort of story of why we started talking about it. And then at a broader level, there's this big push in the nonprofit and social sector about thinking about what our governance structures look like, and why is the majority of leadership in our sector primarily white, upper class people, when that's not the people that are really receiving the services. And more broadly, what does it mean to actually create governance structures that can include the people you serve in the leadership of the organization? And so we did a lot of research. We spent about a year kind of thinking through different programs, talking to people about their structures, and adopted this shared leadership structure. So now we do have a co-directorship. Nida, Camila, and I are co-directors. And I always say we've always operated as co-directors. It's just that now we have like a fancy title. And
so were you previously the executive director?
I was the executive director. And then Nida was head chef, which I also, there's a lot of dynamics that are part of those titles. And Camila was fellowship director. So she joined us to really do the programming. But we did all the strategic planning together. We did all the budgeting together, but it was never intentional. It was never kind of okay, this is what we're, and so I think that's why we shifted to this co-directorship model. So it has to be that way no matter who is part of this organization. And one thing I think is really interesting is that a lot of research suggests that shared leadership models make it easier for people with lived experience to actually participate in leadership, because they might not have some of those traditional professional skills that people look in an executive director, but they have all this other knowledge and experience, and that is absolutely crucial, and I think makes us work better, but can't be represented, maybe won't be elected as the one co-director. And so I think that's what this makes, the co-directorship makes possible.
So you've mentioned some of the, I'm sure there's pros and cons to everything, right? So pros of shared leadership are to elevate the leadership role of people with lived experience. Can you share some other pros and cons?
Yeah. So one, I'll start with some of the cons. I think some people say it does create issues of accountability among the directors.
Yeah, like the buck stops here.
Exactly. So that's why we really chose to have each director have a very specific kind of set of responsibilities. Okay. It's also, communication is more complicated, obviously, because it's 3 people. But on the flip side, it's also in some ways easier because it's not all decisions have to go through one person.
So there's no bottleneck.
Exactly. Yeah. And in other ways, what a lot of people suggest is that it's easier for nonprofits, especially or social projects, to respond to changing needs when their leadership is shared. And when it's kind of lived experience. So it's all connected. But because it's not just one person with one perspective, it's possible for them to respond to crises in more creative ways, in faster ways, in more responsive ways, because there's more opinions represented. And I think I personally really believe in dialogue as something that's really important to make decisions. And I think the other thing I'll say as a leader of a nonprofit is that a lot of executive directors are very burnt out and feel very lonely, and they feel this huge responsibility for this whole community. And I think there's something really liberating about saying, actually, this isn't the decision that I just made. We made it as a community. We made it as a group. And none of us is individually responsible for the well-being of all these people that we're trying to help.
This is really interesting because now I kind of want to be a co-director of an organization. And I always used to tell myself, I have many life goals, and it's not one of them to be an executive director.
Right.
Or CEO of an organization. I actually don't want to. That job doesn't appeal to me. But the idea of being in charge of one pillar of an organization with another person or 2 other people, that is very appealing.
Oh, I love that.
So, and it's counterintuitive because I would have thought it must take them forever to make a decision, but it sounds like it actually makes it it's the opposite.
I think so. And I think we've operated that way since we kind of started because of this whole history of kind of being intentional about who's part of the decision making. But I think it's part of the reason why we survived COVID, why we've been able to do things in kind of a unique and original way. Because there's so many different perspectives, and we're really thinking through things together.
I wonder whether this is unique to the nonprofit sector and to certain organizations. I'll definitely ask my colleagues if shared leadership is found or is common in for-profits and see what they say. Okay, cool. So we talked a little bit about iterating your business model and about your unique shared leadership, like flat structure. I'd like to talk a little bit about raising funds because you mentioned earlier that you used to tell the story that you thought people wanted to hear until the coach from the Moth came and volunteered and said, tell me the real story. So how has your relationship and your approach to funders evolved over the years as your business model and organizational structure has evolved?
Yes, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think there's a few elements of fundraising that are a bit complicated. One is for kind of what I'm fundraising for specifically. One is that we are trying to create systemic change, which some people really love and some people really don't want to happen. Despite wanting other people to, get job training, they don't really want power dynamics to shift. And so I think that's where it was really hard for me to risk so much money, especially in an organization that is constantly fighting to even exist, and to say, oh no, I'm going to actually open up to this person about the fact that we kind of want to change the power balances that keep them in a position of privilege, and I'm going to need to ask them money for this. So I think I
guess the third book I should have brought is Winners Take All.
Oh yes,
because that talks a lot about that.
Exactly. Next time. But I think that's the kind of hard part of fundraising. And I think 2 things. One is I initially took a lot of money that then from people that were kind of aligned with me, but not really. And I knew, but I needed the money. And it really ended up kind of, what's the word for it, coming back?
Yeah.
Backfiring.
Yeah.
Backfiring because, we ended up having to ask them to kind of not take a leadership position as advisors because they clearly didn't understand kind of our theory of change and what we wanted to accomplish. And so after that, I really started saying, okay, I need to find people that really believe in what we do, and that won't kind of try to drift the mission in another direction. And I think there's a few ways. First of all, being a social enterprise makes it even more doable because we do have 50% of revenue coming from sales, so that gives us a bit more independence compared to a traditional charity model.
Yeah.
But then we also shifted to more grassroots fundraising.
Because even with a social enterprise, you could be seeking impact investors, all sorts of funders.
Exactly. So to grassroots fundraising, which I really believe in, it's the kind of like Bernie Sanders, Obama, $5.
It's kind of like your leadership structure,
Exactly.
like shared, flat.
Exactly. It's all part of kind of our ethos in a certain way. And I think it makes it a lot more possible to do organizing work and to have freedom over what we want to do.
It's unrestricted funds.
Exactly. Exactly.
And nonprofit speak. You have your earned revenue and your unrestricted donations.
And the other thing I'll say is we also have found like a community of people that really believe in what we do, and I think that's really exciting. I think partially it's probably because I actually started thinking about what we do or talking about it, and so people that are excited about it started, looking for us. And secondly, I think during COVID there was a big shift in funding towards, I think systems change. At least that's what I saw in terms of a lot of foundations are now thinking about, okay, what does it mean to invest in
I think during COVID, a lot of the underlying root causes of social disparities were suddenly spotlighted in a way that they had only been for a certain audience in the past decades and centuries, but they became more, people were talking about them in a more widespread way. And it was an opportunity for education of funders and nonprofits and everything in terms of thinking about these underlying policies and structures and biases.
Yes, and I think so as a result there have been a lot more, I think, foundations or innovation prizes for the specific kind of work that we are doing, and governance structures that are more flat or more democratic. So I think the beauty of that has been finding a community of donors that actually we feel comfortable with and can support what we want to do.
So the other book I brought with me is Entrepreneurship Ecosystems by Banu Pan and her co-author, which talks about gender in entrepreneurship. And you've been talking about this women-led organization, and all three directors are women. And I wondered whether you've experienced any gendered aspects to entrepreneurship and how you experienced them.
Well, I do consider myself very lucky because I'm a woman-run organization, so I'm sheltered on a daily basis from a lot of it. But I think definitely in terms of funding and fundraising, that's very present. In smaller ways, like the fact that people are more used to the way that male entrepreneurs present their projects, which I think tends to be a bit more grandiose and, certain energy about it. I think other things like, the big shift during COVID has been that I meet donors on Zoom, and I felt a lot more comfortable with male donors on Zoom because before I had a lot of just sexual harassment or just, dinner parties, events, networking events where I didn't know if the person was trying to give me money or if it was because I was a young woman, or if, a man would put their hands on me in strange ways. And I think in that sense, Zoom has made it much more comfortable for me and much more, much less intimidating just because there's no room for any kind of physical issues on the call. And so in that sense, that's been helpful. I think also I do tend to fundraise among women especially. But I think there's definitely a lot of difficulties to being a woman entrepreneur in a space that is, all modeled around, Jeff Bezos and all the
One of the cases in Banu's book is about the WeWork case and all the things that the WeWork founder did and claimed and erratic behaviors. And she used the example of the emperor's new clothes and saying that, you know, there were just a lot of promises made that weren't really based on facts. And I think the literature shows there are gender differences between the way women founders present facts and male founders present aspirations or claims.
And I often will tell myself, like, channel the male energy in you and just promise a bit more than you know for a fact you can achieve, because that's definitely and yes, as you said, I've read that as well, that women just tend to kind of project in more realistic ways and do less of the kind of grandiose projecting. But I think that has a space too. So sometimes I'm just like, go for it.
You know, but the Zoom comment you made really hit home to me, and it's not something I've ever thought about Zoom as a protective factor. And I can't help but wondering whether Zoom has kind of leveled the playing field for others as well, not just across gender, but across race or other factors that might have prevented certain people getting into the room or into the meeting compared to others. I wonder.
That's an interesting point. I actually, while you were saying that, I thought of our organizing efforts, and I think a lot of the women, when we talk to state representatives or things like that, they'll come on Zoom, but they don't show their faces or anything like that. And I think for those that are a bit more conservative and might not actually feel comfortable, it has really created a bit more just security and
least
safety.
they're there.
Exactly. And I don't know if they would be coming to the meetings if they were in person. So I think there are different kinds of benefits sometimes in terms of safety.
I'd like to end by asking you to talk a little bit about your organizing efforts, because I understand how the cafe model works. You train people, you help them get a job, but then how and where and when and why does that lead to building power in a collective way?
So that's a great question. I think a few things is during the program, our ESL classes are popular education classes in addition to being English classes. So they are organized around stories of women organizers in U.S. history that have kind of built movements or made change in their community in some sort of way. And so that's kind of when we start introducing this idea of community power and this idea of, you know, for example, we teach vocabulary around taking the bus through the story of Rosa Parks. We have a module on going to work that's around the story of Dolores Huerta. And, you know, there'll be questions like, if you're in an abusive workplace, what do you think you should do? What could you do? And you know, we watch these women go from, oh, of course, I'm not going to say anything, to maybe one person suggests, but really, should you be having to deal with this? And so starting to have these conversations about, you know, what are things that we aren't okay with dealing with in our life, and at the same time learning, oh, there is a minimum wage in the state of Connecticut, and I have these rights as a worker. So we have workers' rights workshops. We introduce them to a lot of just information that's obviously really important to understanding kind of legal and community resources available to you. And I that's kind of, I think, the personal learning that's at the root of that shift. And just as an example, one of the women in our program, she's been undocumented for 2 years in the United States. She's very young. She has a few children. And before the program, she was working in a very abusive working conditions. And after the program, she was scared we wouldn't help her find a good job. So she just went back to kind of this very abusive work environment. Not the same one, but another one. And I think 2 weeks later, she called us and she was like, he's not paying me minimum wage. Like, I'm not staying here anymore. And she asked us to go as a group and tell him that he had to pay her minimum wage. And she ended up leaving. But that's just a kind of, you know, shift in terms of understanding yourself as someone that has the power. And then in terms of community, we have weekly organizing meetings after the program. Everyone is invited, and I'd say 50% of our fellows end up actively engaging in them. And right now they're focusing on housing as the issue that's most prevalent for all of them, and are doing a campaign asking the mayor to allocate COVID relief funds to rent relief and to affordable housing. And they're working in coalition with unhoused people in New Haven, with Black Women Collective and Dixwell, and just a lot of other groups, and really starting to mobilize and organize. And to be honest, when we started thinking about this, I was always like, it's not going to really start creating change, but it's been really incredible to watch what starts happening when people, decide, no, I'm not going to put up with this because I have a community that I can make change with.
So it really went from being about the baklava to being about the community and what happens when you bring women together and let them take it from there.
Exactly.
Like the training is only a starting point and the jobs are only a starting point to really activate their leadership, their collective leadership also. So what do you think is next in this evolution?
Well, I think, I always say, like, my role at Havenly was to make myself no longer needed. And I think of that as a broader kind of career goal, which is a bit strange. But if I'm no longer needed, that means that this problem has been solved at a systemic level. And I think what I'm excited for is to watch, the campaigns that the women choose to pursue. Right now we have 21 graduates. If we have 15 women per cohort for 3 years, we would have 120 graduates. So what does it mean to have 120 women that are empowered in that sense and that have that community and that are organizing and empowering other women in the community? And then what would it mean to have 120 women in 10 cities in the United States? So I think that's kind of the dream for it and where I hope to see. And I think the beautiful thing is that I can't really say what they will do, but I can say that I really believe in just this idea of having that community empowered and leading.
And one of the policies you mentioned is that the root cause of this is that refugees in the U.S. have 90 days to find a job, and then they kind of get trapped in this cycle, in the lower paid jobs rather than being able to spend time on training and education. And so perhaps that could be a policy that could be changed by this collective force.
Exactly. And that's a perfect example of, if the policy changed and, for example, we had a 6-month training program at a governmental level, then we wouldn't need the Havenly program, and that would be really where the problem is.
And it's not unthinkable that you could achieve that at the Connecticut level.
Absolutely.
So I think circling back to what you were hoping to do as a student before you even started this and working on refugee integration models, I think there will be different ways you can approach this over the course of your lifetime and your career. And it sounds like what started with baklava and evolved into a community collective leadership model is only the beginning, and who knows where it will evolve from here. So, thank you so much for taking the time, Caterina, to speak to my students today and to record this podcast. It's an honor having you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks.